Out in Montana, it's still the Wild West. We're real straight shooters, which is our way of saying this podcast isn't for children. We have some big problems to talk about, and we hope you will join us in hunting them down and gutting them.
This is the first episode of Big Problems Under the Big Sky, so it's logical to get into some introductions. Let's start with the person who's speaking right now. My name is Ty. I'm excited to start in and start talking and see where this goes. We're hoping to cover some political things that don't get talked about in nearly enough detail, and we'll get into more about why, where, after my colleagues here introduce themselves as well. Do you want to go next?
Sure.
As you're putting a cup of coffee, that was perfect.
Of course it was. Great segue there. I'm Jacob. I've worked with Ty here off and on for the last few years. Worked in and around the political field in Montana since 2020 and overall since 2018. But excited to hunt down the root of these problems, as we said in our intro earlier. And then we'll throw it off to our gracious host.
Yeah, so my name is Darren. I have been kind of involved in state politics since I was in college in 2014. I was just a data intern for several Republican candidates in the state, since it's a statewide seat. But the other reason why we are making this podcast too is we also kind of felt that the rural voice of rural states is never really talked about, and the experiences that you have just living in a very rural state. It's not vast majority of people don't really live in rural states. They live in urban and bigger states than the state of Montana. And so that's the reason why we are kind of doing this podcast as well.
Talk about the differences that we face here than every other podcast out there about the struggle of living in New York City or California or something.
Yeah, a lot of those issues just don't get to Montana, but they cause a lot of frustration. So I'm sure we'll talk about those sorts of issues. Like
abortion
access, LGBT issues, which become larger issues here in Montana. But when you're talking to Montanans who are living and working here, that those sorts of issues come up less frequently. So maybe just do some general housekeeping of Big Problems Under the Big Sky. How often are we doing this? What's the format we're looking at?
Yeah, at the moment at least, we're going to be putting these out once a month as we get used to the podcast life, for lack of a better way to call it. So once a month we'll be putting episodes out. We'll be breaking each episode down over the course of an overall topic with some smaller bits and pieces we'll get into throughout it. Like today, our episode is going to be just kind of a how we got to where we are kind of episode as far as the political landscape of Montana goes. We'll each talk about different periods of time that led us into the shit show and disaster that we are all currently living in here in Montana.
Well, you said a swear.
Oh
yeah.
Boy.
Got to get the first one out of the way early,
That's great. How we're going to go about this for the first episode is, we'll talk about the past.
A lot.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about the past. I think the majority of this first episode is, how did we get here? We're going to go as far back as,
would you say 21?
Yeah, we're going to cover the last 100 years of Montana's political landscape. Because you can't really know where you're at today without knowing where you came from. So going into this realm, so really Montana's political environment has always kind of existed within its own bubble outside of the national sphere. While national politics is always influenced within Montana as political landscape, but it's really kind of just always been apart from it. And so going back all the way to it really starts kind of back into the early settler days of people coming to Montana. People came to Montana, mostly the government paid people to come here. No one wanted to live here besides finding the gold, the copper, and the silver. But once those kind of dried up, people really didn't want to live in a very rural state in the middle of nowhere. And so the government actually started through the Merrill Land Grant Acts and other homesteading acts and other acts in those same veins and additions to those acts throughout the 1800s leading into the 1900s. The government essentially gave people plots of land to come live here and homestead. So you'd see massive influxes of people moving to Montana for these homesteads. They give them a couple acres of land that they would They didn't have to pay, but they would just be required to pretty much just grow a farm or grow a ranch on there, and that was the only stipulation you needed to come to live in Montana.
I mean, nowadays, it feels like I need the government to give me a house if I ever wanted to be able to afford one here.
Right, so it's like we've almost gone back full circle. And so coming back into the 19th century or the 20th century, that's what you see is these family plots be giving out just by acreage. So if you ever took a map of like the government-owned land, the state-owned land, the private land of Montana, you'd see it's a very checkered board across the entire state. And they did that because they would give a parcel of land to a family, divide it between a government land, and then give another parcel of land to another family. And they gave them out between like 5 to 20 acres. And so today, it's almost insanity to think the government gave out just 20 acres of land to people. In some cases, they'd give out hundreds of acres of land. And you'd still see, and the beauty of it is you still actually see some of those like family farms still in the state. A lot of them gone away. I mean, we can discuss the whole plethora of issues that created that. And one of those big issues that actually created that was World War One. So
what kind of people were living in Montana at those early 100 years ago?
Right. So like the number one population in Montana in 1913 was German. We see a massive influx of German and Central European peoples move into the United States, and particularly Germany, because Germany in the 1870s had the unification of Germany that Prussia started and then finished with the Franco-Prussian War. A lot of Germans were very angry that the Prussians formed Germany, and so they fled the country, or they emigrated from Europe to the United States. A lot of them made landfall in Michigan, Wisconsin, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. In fact, one of the major languages spoken wasn't English in Montana, it was German. A lot of newspapers from across the state printed only in German, some printed in German and English because the most dominant language was German. Of course, there was tons of other European nationalities and ethnicities that moved into Montana, but that was the major one that moved into the state. And even my ancestors actually were part of that group. They were very furious with how Prussia formed Germany, and they didn't want to be part of a Prussian German, which is a weird thing to say. And so they fled Germany, or what would become Germany, to Montana. And so they've been there for a while. Some of them, some extended parts of my family, went back to Germany for World War I to fight for the German side because the U.S. wasn't involved at the onset of World War I yet. Because what the U.S. did was they kind of played both sides. They traded with the Triple Entente, and they also traded with the Allied powers at the start of the war.
Getting out of Central Europe, in the early 1910s sounds like a real good time to get out.
Yeah, so they were pretty smart about that.
So what about all the indigenous populations there? I think it would be.
Yeah, and so that's the other kind of like very sore issue about it, even in this state. And it wouldn't even take us till like another 60 years to kind of rectify that. So the Indian War started after the Civil War. Usually put it around the 1870s. These Indian Wars is what started forcing the Native Americans who already lived here in the state of Montana and the regions around, like Wyoming, Idaho, North and South Dakota, and to force them into their reservations. So Montana has, I believe, 7 reservations. And in Montana, we were not, you probably, if you've ever watched the news in the early, from 2022 and 2021 and 2020, about the Canadian boarding schools, Montana was definitely not absolved of
free of those same actions.
Yeah, so Montana had dozens of boarding schools for Native Americans. I mean, I don't think the state allowed Native Americans to vote in state elections until the 1970s. They even classified them as citizens of the state until 1973.
Yeah, the Native Americans were some of the last people to get
the right to vote.
Their rights, and they still don't have as many.
Yeah.
As they should.
Yeah, so it's a very black, dark stain on Montana's history, with the Native Americans and how they were treated in this state, and really
still are treated.
And still are, yeah. It's still very prevalent today. And so going into World War I, what ended up happening was during World War I, at the start of World War I in Europe, the United States didn't join the war, right? And so they played both sides. They traded with Germany and the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. They traded with France, Great Britain, and all the other dozens of small nations around the world. They played both sides to come out on top. And so one of the things that ended up happening that I think is rarely ever talked about, even in U.S. history, even in Montana's like school curriculum history, is the removal of the crop rotation in the state, because prior to World War One, it was kind of common practice amongst the small farmers, family farmers, and industrial farmers to only use a percentage of your acreage to grow your crops and rotate them out over the years so you didn't dry up the soil and you didn't burn through all the nutrients in the top of the soil where you couldn't grow anything anymore. Well, with the onset of World War One, demand for crops and agriculture skyrocketed with the same demand for raw materials that were used in the machines of war. And so what Montana farmers did was they just started growing everything on all their land as fast as they could, as much as they could, because they could finally make a huge profit and flood the market with their product and not have to worry about making or having the price drop. And so this increased demand led to increased supply, which then went away with the crop rotation. And then once the U.S. got into World War One, then of course all the people had to leave the farms and go fight in the war. And Montana has always had a strong and proud history of supplying the large numbers of men for all the world conflicts, both World War One and World War Two. 10% of our population today is a veteran or currently serving in the military. And even back in 1914, 1916, 1918, it was the exact same deal. Montana sent per capita the most people go fight in World War One. So once World War One concluded, the U.S. really kind of came out on top, right? They weren't savaged by the things of war, trench warfare. Like the countryside wasn't destroyed. Even though it was one of our bloodiest wars and we lost hundreds of thousands of people, we still came out on top. Our industry was booming. People came back and they had jobs available for them. The economy was doing fantastic. We all know the Roaring Twenties, but one thing that I mentioned previously that is never talked about is the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl actually started in Montana in 1919, 1920, because when they went away with the crop rotation, they grew all the crops they possibly could, and then once those crops were done after several cycles of growing, the entire surface of the soil was just devoid of all its nutrients and all the actual things needed to help grow crops.
You can definitely tell we're farmers here.
Yes, very rural.
So how much of Montana is farmers?
Well, back then it used to be about like 40, 50, 60%. Nearly half the state was a very rural state. Again, because the government paid people to come live here and work and live on farms. And that was kind of the stipulation of growing here. Now, all of a sudden, that attraction for coming to being a farmer was gone because the Dust Bowl started. You couldn't grow crops on a dusty field. And so many family farms either sold off to some corporation, sold back to the government, or they just simply left and they either went into town or they moved to other states where there was that economic opportunity caused by the Roaring Twenties. So again, like I said previously, Montana has always existed in its own little bubble outside the national scope. So while the part of the nation was in the Roaring Twenties and saw a massive economic and industrial boom, Montana was actually facing the exact opposite. So they were losing thousands of citizens who were moving out of state. So that manpower that could go fuel the industries, like the extracting resource industries like coal and lumber, were losing the manpower because they were moving to other states where they could go work in a factory instead. So Montana's population kind of shrunk down here, and the whole farming industry and agriculture industry really shrunk in Montana because of this. And you can see it a lot with the politics of the state. So during this time, you can see a lot of Republican control of both the state house, state legislature, and the governorship. But the other really unique thing about Montana that you don't really see in other states, during this time of the early 1920s and 30s, was there was dozens and dozens of independent parties. And these weren't just like one or two candidates winning. It was dozens of candidates winning. I think the highest was 16 out of like 40 seats were an independent party. You'd have independent parties like the Farm Labor Party because they were formed to stop this mass exodus of family farmers and laborers who relied on these farms to provide them with like their livelihood that were slowly going away.
So what would that look like? You know, we're pretty familiar with the two-party system. You know,
working two-party system that we all see today.
No, it's working, I guess. We're still here, right?
We might have a different understanding of the definition of the word working, but yeah, I'm
working. I go to work.